I've been a big Pokemon fan since the game first came out when I was about 10 years old. Over the last decade, I haven't really played the game much, but all that changed once I found out about Pokemon Go. I downloaded the game the morning it was released. I started playing the game here and there in my free time. Soon enough, I figured out how the game worked, learned about gyms and the competitive side of the game, and I was hooked. My friend Jake is also really into the game, and soon enough, the two of us would go out Pokemon hunting several evenings per week. Occasionally, he and I would also get together in the morning before we had to go to work. We tried picking locations to go to that had a lot of good areas to walk in, and also areas that had plenty of Pokestops. For anyone that isn't familiar with the game, Pokestops are real-world landmarks in the game, such as churches, statues, and other landmarks. When you walk to these locations with the app open, you can spin an orb on the screen and receive items you need to use in the game. Another way to take advantage of Pokestops are placing lures on them. When someone places a lure on a Pokestop, everyone else playing will see it. The lure attracts more Pokemon to the Pokestop and will benefit anyone playing the game nearby. Jake and I have been playing the game at the same times of the day and at most of the same locations each time. After a few weeks of catching countless Weedles, Pidgeys, and Caterpies, we decided we would try playing the game at a different time than normal. I read that going Pokemon hunting at night can often produce some more uncommon Pokemon that you wouldn't find as easy during the day, particularly Fairy-type Pokemon. Jake and I decided we would go hunting for Pokemon on a Friday night and see what we would come up with. He came over to my house around 9 p.m. and we got set to go. Both of our phones were charged and we had our battery packs ready. Pokemon drains a phone's battery almost as fast as anything. We decided we would go to a hiking trail that was pretty close nearby. It had a lot of areas we could explore and plenty of Pokestops. We also knew there was a pond and a creek that ran through it, along with some deep woods. So all the different types of nature should give us a variety of Pokemon that pop up. Since the park technically closed when it got dark, we knew we had to be pretty sneaky. I drove us to the park, but parked my car about a quarter mile down the street. That way, it wouldn't be so obvious that someone was at the park. We got out of the car and headed down the street toward the park. It was still a bit warm out at this point, but there was a pretty nice breeze making it close to perfect to be outside walking at night. We were both pretty excited. The anticipation for what we might be able to catch was also pretty high. There was also an extra element of excitement due to us sneaking into the park after hours. We talked about how it was going to be cool to be the only ones in this massive park, and joked around about running into other people that sneaked into the park for the same reason as us. After a few minutes of walking, we finally reached the entrance to the park. We looked around a bit to make sure the coast was clear and headed in. We headed down the trail and began our search. It was very dark in the park and there were no lights. Also, with our eyes almost constantly staring at the screens of our phones, we never gave ourselves a chance to have our eyesight adjusted to our surroundings. Still though, we did our best to get around safely and remain pretty aware of our surroundings. We walked around on various trails for a good 30 minutes. We were catching a decent amount of the common Pokemon, and a few semi-rare ones here and there. Nothing exciting though. That's when we decided we would leave the trail and venture into the woods. Looking back, I guess it didn't make much sense to do this. But at the time, we just kind of pictured some rare Pokemon hiding out deep into the woods. After about 10 minutes of trying not to trip over branches, we started to regret this decision. There wasn't even anything on our phones indicating that there were Pokemon nearby. Eventually, we just decided to head back to the trail. We walked for a bit in what we thought was the right direction. After some time went by, we began to realize we were getting lost. We started to become less interested in the game, and more interested in figuring out how to get back to the trails. I decided to close out Pokemon and open up my Maps app. It turned out we were way deeper into the woods than we thought. We somehow managed to zigzag our way almost 2 miles deep into the woods. I figured out which direction we needed to walk in and pulled up the compass app on my phone. We began to jetline our way through the woods as fast as we could, now that we knew we were headed the right way. It was a bit after midnight at this point. After about 5 minutes of being headed in the right direction, I heard Jake say, "Dude, wait up." I turned around and he was still standing looking down at his phone. He turned his phone towards me to show me the screen. I walked over to him to get a better look. He still had Pokemon Go running on his phone. On the map, there was a small little green circle close to us, indicating a clearing or something other than the woods. But it wasn't just that. There was also a Pokestop in it. But the really weird part was that this Pokestop had a lure activated on it. Lures only last 30 minutes, so that means someone had been at this Pokestop and placed this lure within the last 30 minutes. Jake and I both looked up at each other in surprise and confusion. Who would be out in the woods so late? And why pick this Pokespot to place a lure at? Why not pick one of the other dozens locations around here? One that doesn't require hiking through the woods in the middle of the night. Jake and I went back and forth about whether or not we should go check the Pokestop out. We had heard stories about people placing lures at Pokestops to set people up to be robbed. We decided that no one would choose this location to try to do that at, as the odds of anyone being close enough to see the lure were slim to none, especially at this time of night. It must be someone else that ended up in the woods while searching for Pokemon as well and found this Pokestop. Or they knew it was there and went to it on purpose. Maybe they know something we don't. Maybe there's a nest nearby for a special type of Pokemon. I pulled the Pokemon Go app back up on my phone and we headed to the Pokestop. It took us only a few minutes to reach the Pokestop. We walked out of the woods into a small clearing, probably around the size of half of a football field. In the middle of the clearing was a weird statue of a Native American holding a canoe over his shoulder. There were a few benches around the statue. We went and sat down and began the Pokemon hunt. We were expecting to run into other people playing the game since there was a lure activated, but surprisingly, no one was there. We mentioned to one another that it was a bit weird, and then continued playing the game. Suddenly, we heard a loud crack coming from the woods behind us. It sounded like someone stepped on a large branch and cracked it. We both turned to look around. I was expecting to see another person playing Pokemon and look for someone walking through the woods, illuminated by the glow of their phone. But no one was there. It didn't help that I had been staring at a phone screen non-stop before trying to look for someone in the woods. I brushed it off as an animal or something and went back to the game. Jake and I played for a few more minutes, and then the lure expired and went away. At that point, we decided we should probably head back. As soon as we got up and were about to leave, another lure appeared at that Pokestop. Jake and I immediately looked at each other and then began to look around. In order for someone to set a lure up at this Pokestop, they would have to be pretty close, probably within 30 feet or so at the most. Someone was out there in the woods, and we couldn't see them. Jake and I began talking quietly to ourselves. Why would someone put a lure at this Pokestop and then just hang out in the woods? Why wouldn't they rather sit comfortably on one of the benches? Was someone out here playing Pokemon and decided to mess with us once they saw us coming? None of the conclusions we came to really made any sense. We both admitted to each other we were pretty uncomfortable and decided we needed to leave. I pulled up the compass on my phone and we started to head back to the woods. And then suddenly, we heard a blood-curdling scream. It stopped us dead in our tracks. Jake and I looked at each other. I could see the fear in his eyes. I'm sure he saw it in my eyes too. Without saying anything to each other, we both started heading in the direction away from the scream. We had no idea what was going on and wanted nothing to do with it. We walked for several minutes through the woods and began to feel a little bit more comfortable. Just as I was about to try and laugh the situation off to Jake, I heard another large crack. This time, it sounded like the sound of someone hitting a baseball with a bat. I heard it again, and then again. As the sound got closer and closer, I began hearing footsteps as well. I told Jake we needed to get the fuck out of here, and we began running. The footsteps and the occasional cracking noise followed us. It must have been someone hitting a large stick on a tree or something. We both ran as fast as we could, occasionally halfway falling down as we tripped over the various brush we ran into. I'd say we ran for about another 5 minutes before stopping. We both knelt down to catch our breath and listen for anyone that might still be following us. We didn't hear anything. After a minute of resting, we continued hiking through the woods. We eventually reached one of the trails and jogged all the way back to the car. We made it home safely and never heard another peep from whoever was following us. To this day, I have no clue what happened that night. I've come up with about a dozen theories, but the only one that makes sense is that someone was randomly playing Pokemon in the woods that night. Once they heard us coming, they ran off to hide. From there, they did whatever they could to terrorize us as a joke or something. But who knows, maybe it was something else. All I know is that this will be the last time I play Pokemon Go in the middle of nowhere. This is something that happened to me a few nights ago. I run a small business. A few large retail stores in my area contract work out to me. I assemble their bicycles, grills, patio furniture, etc. I typically work third shift, as most of the stores I work for prefer me to be there when there aren't very many customers. I usually take a few breaks throughout the night. Ever since I started playing Pokemon Go, my breaks consist of me going on walks so I can visit nearby Pokestops, hatch my eggs, and search for Pokemon. There are a few different routes I like to take on my breaks. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to take a break. I took my phone out and opened up Pokemon Go so I could start having distance added to my eggs. On this particular break, I decided I would take a walk to the park. There were a few Pokestops there and it was about a 25-minute round trip. I began walking through the empty parking lots. The walk there took a while because for whatever reason, it seems the parking lots are one of the favorite spots for Pokemon to congregate at. I eventually made my way down the empty street and reached the park entrance. At the entrance of the park, you pull into a driveway. The driveway is about a quarter-mile long or so. At the end of it is a parking lot. There are a few Pokestops leading to the parking lot. Once I got to the parking lot, there was a large van parked there. It wasn't on, and I didn't see anyone sitting in the front seat, so I just assumed it was either broken down or left there for some other reason. I walked down one of the short trails that led to the final Pokestop and began to head back to work. When I got back to the parking lot, I realized the van was gone. It kind of made me uncomfortable, just knowing someone else was here, but I didn't see any trace of them. It is just something unusual to run into at this time of night. I started walking back down the driveway towards the main road. As I came around the bend, I saw the van sitting there, parked further up ahead in the driveway. The van was idling and had its lights off. At this point, I had no logical reason to assume that whoever was in the van had any ill intentions. They were probably just here to play Pokemon as well and got distracted by the game, so they decided to park. Still, my gut told me I needed to stay far, far away from that van. I decided I would take the long way back to the store. Unfortunately, I couldn't cut through the woods to the right because there was a fence blocking it, so I had to cut through the grass to the left of me and then eventually circle back to the right so I could get back to the store. Regardless of what the person in the van was doing, I really didn't want them to see me. I turned around and headed back towards the parking lot so I could put some more distance between the van and I. Once I felt like there was enough room for me to cut around through the grass behind them, I started walking. I walked fast. I just wanted to get out of the park safely and get back to the comfort of the store I was working in. My shoes began to get very wet from the damp grass, but I wasn't doubting my decision at all. I finally reached the main road. I jogged across it quickly and began speed walking back in the direction of the store. The entrance of the park was coming up on my right, across the street from me. I began to get this awful, sick feeling. I didn't see the van or anything, but I just couldn't help the feeling that came over me. I was finally passing the entrance to the park when I was hit by a bright beam of light. I was frozen like a deer in headlights for a moment. I quickly realized it was headlights and began walking even faster towards the store. I couldn't see if it was the van or not because the light was too bright, but I knew it was. I continued down the street and heard the van accelerating. As I listened, I was eventually able to tell that the van was headed towards me in the same direction I was headed. I kept my head down and continued speed walking. I didn't know what was going on with that van or whoever was in it, and I wanted no part of it. The van got closer. I could tell they were about to pass me. I was just about to approach the end of the parking lot of the store, and then I heard the van lock up their brakes and come screeching to a halt. The side door of the van came violently sliding open. Without hesitating, I jumped over this small guardrail and slid down this ravine. I ended up in about 2 feet of water once I reached the bottom. I finally looked up at the van. What I saw was nothing short of horrifying. I wasn't able to see into the driver's window, but at the side of the van was a man dressed in dark clothes. He had something dark on over his face that hid what he looked like. He jumped back into the side of the van, slid the door shut, and they took off. I climbed out of the water and retreated to the safety of the store. I called the police and explained what happened. They took a report and said they would keep an eye out for a van matching the description of the one I gave them. A week went by and I didn't hear anything. I went back to the same store several times and didn't have any issues. Obviously, I stopped playing Pokemon Go in that area. Then, one night when I was heading to that store, I was stopped at an intersection. My heart jumped into my throat as I looked over at the line of cars waiting to turn onto the other road. It was the van. I was sure of it. I ended up following the van. There were a couple cars between us, and I made sure to keep distance, even though I doubt they'd be able to see me through my windshield, and they didn't know what kind of car I drove. After about 10 minutes of tailing them, they ended up parking behind a small plaza. I parked my car in a way that hid me, but also allowed me to keep an eye on the van. I called the police, and they cooperated a lot more than I expected them to. They sent a couple cruisers out to approach the van, and as it would turn out, I was right. They found several men inside the van at the time. Apparently, since I made my initial police report, 2 other people also called the police about the guys in the van. Both of these people were playing Pokemon and were robbed. Each of them were attacked after visiting a Pokestop. Both people were beaten pretty bad. Instead of threatening people and demanding their money and phones and whatever else, these guys would just attack people, beat them until they passed out, and then rifled through their pockets, taking anything they wanted. The men were found with weapons, cash, and some other stuff that didn't appear to belong to them. I'm so glad I followed them and called the police. I know I saved someone else from getting hurt. I checked my phone before I left, and sure enough, there was a Pokestop nearby. I feel so lucky. My gut instinct saved me that night. Don't play Pokemon at night, especially not alone. Make it a group event and go to well-lit, populated areas. You gotta catch them all, but don't need to get badly hurt or killed in the process. So I was never really into Pokemon. I heard about Pokemon Go when it first came out because so many of my Facebook friends were talking about it. I honestly thought the idea of it was kinda confusing and seemed pretty dumb. I found out my best friend Paul downloaded the game and had been playing it non-stop since it was released. He explained how it worked to me and told me over and over how much fun it was. Eventually, curiosity got the best of me and I decided to download the game, just to check it out and see what all the hype was about. Paul came over and we went around looking for Pokemon. It was at this point he showed me how to play the game. Needless to say, it didn't take long until I had it figured out and became pretty hooked. I still don't really know much about the origin of Pokemon, the show, or any of the other games, but I'm pretty familiar with the Pokemon that are in the Pokemon Go app. Paul and I decided to go out one night to hunt Pokemon. He knew of a really popular spot that many people went to. We got to the location and spent a couple hours walking around visiting Pokestops and collecting Pokemon. Eventually, it was time to head home. On the ride home, I still had the Pokemon app open on my phone so I could collect items from Pokestops as we passed by them. All of a sudden, a Lapras appeared on my phone. For those of you that may not know, a Lapras is a rather rare Pokemon. At the time, neither Paul or I had one yet. Paul scrambled to get his phone out of his pocket and open up the Pokemon app. Not wanting to miss out on catching this rare Pokemon, Paul quickly pulled over to the side of the road to park. In the midst of doing this, he cut a car off. Paul was definitely in the wrong for doing that and acted hastily. The car in the right lane that Paul pulled over to was forced to slam on their brakes so they didn't hit us. Paul expressed how stupid his actions were. Before we were even able to get out of the car, the driver behind us pulled up beside Paul's car. There was a man in the car. He looked to be about 35-40 years old. He was understandably upset and began shouting at both Paul and I. Paul apologized and we got out of the car and began walking in the direction of the Lapras. As we walked away, the man continued yelling at us. He seemed to become more irate because we walked away and didn't sit there and listen to him scream at us. Finally, he peeled out and drove away. Paul and I walked around the location of where I first spotted the Lapras. Luckily, we got there in time and eventually it popped up. We were pretty happy and walked back to the car. It was close to 10 o'clock by this point, and we both really needed to get home. We got in the car and started driving home. Once we turned at the intersection we were parked next to, a car came out of nowhere and was suddenly behind us. They were following behind us very, very close. They were so close we couldn't even see their headlights. Paul mentioned that he felt like brake checking the car, but knew that they would end up hitting us since they'd have no chance to stop in time. We continued on driving for a while, and the car continued to follow. Eventually, we turned onto the freeway, giving the car behind us a chance to finally pass us, but they didn't. They just continued to follow right behind us. When Paul sped up, the other car sped up. Paul even slowed down to 40 miles an hour on a freeway which has a speed limit of 65 miles per hour. The car just continued to follow right behind us. At this point, we began to feel a little unnerved. We kind of decided that maybe whoever was in the car just didn't want to pass us and wasn't in a hurry. Maybe they were a new driver. We discussed several possibilities that might have been rational reasons they were following us, aside from them just intentionally following us, of course. Eventually, Paul got off the highway. He decided he would completely turn around and go back the opposite way. This would show us if the person was following us intentionally. Paul slowed down and got off the exit. The car followed. We turned left and then got back on the highway, heading the opposite direction we were just coming from. And the car still followed. At this point, we both started to get freaked out. We considered calling the police, but we both knew this person hadn't actually done anything illegal. Luckily for us, we'd gone far enough down the highway to get close to home. Paul decided he would get off at the next exit. We knew these back roads as well as anyone, and Paul felt confident that he could lose the car that way. As we approached the exit, Paul continued to drive the speed limit. Right as we were about to pass it, Paul quickly cut over to the right and got off. The car following us was able to catch on to what he was doing in time and still remain behind us. Paul gunned it straight through the stop sign at the exit and the chase was on. At this point, I was both excited and terrified. Paul was running stop signs, nearly drifting around corners, and driving as fast as the road in his car would allow him. The car behind us somehow managed to stay caught up with us. It was seriously unreal. We made it to this long road that eventually dead-ended into another road. Paul took this opportunity to put the pedal to the floor and create some distance between us and this psycho. It started to work at first. We could see the other car lose distance on us little by little. We finally made it to the end of the road. We were planning on turning right and hopefully becoming home free. My heart dropped as we neared the turn and realized that the road was closed for construction and we couldn't turn right onto it. The only option we had was to turn left. This turn would lead us about a half mile down into nothing except for a dead end. Paul gunned it as fast as he could until we reached the end of the road. Paul then turned off the car and shut off the lights. We both had our adrenaline pumping. We didn't know who was in that car and what they wanted. We didn't know how many of them there were and if they had a gun or not. At this point, we were both expressing our regret for not calling the police or driving to the police station. Things just escalated so fast and went out of control much quicker than we could have known. Suddenly, panic set in when we saw a pair of headlights coming directly towards us. "What should we do?" I said to Paul as I tried not to completely lose it. "Let's hide," he said. We got out of the car. I went and hid behind a tree in the woods, and Paul hid behind the car. I know these weren't great hiding spots, but we only had a few minutes to pick them out. Eventually, the car pulled up right alongside of Paul's. The man quickly got out of the car. That's when I realized who it was. Yep, you guessed it. It was a man who we'd cut off earlier in the night. I was absolutely shocked. I couldn't imagine someone getting that angry over a simple mistake. I've heard of people with extreme road rage, and I could tell this man was extremely angry when it happened. But I just couldn't believe he had put so much time and effort into following us. The man started screaming at us and asking us where we were. He was walking alongside Paul's car, and I knew he was about to spot him. That's when I noticed the man was carrying something. At the time, it looked like a small baseball bat or something. Paul knew he was about to be discovered, so he stood up. The man started walking right at him. Paul immediately tried to reason with him and said, "Look, man, I'm sorry for cutting you off. It was honestly an accident." The man didn't say a word at this point. He just lunged for Paul with a bat and swung it at him. I saw Paul throw his arms up in an attempt to block the blow, but he immediately went down. At this point, he was out of sight and on the other side of the car. All I could hear was Paul screaming. My adrenaline kicked into the max. Part of me wanted to run, as pathetic as that sounds. I guess it was just part of my brain telling me to protect myself, but I knew I couldn't leave Paul. I was sure he was getting severely hurt. I didn't know whether or not this guy was going to kill him. I decided I had to act, and act quick. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. The best thing I could find right at that very second was a pretty decent sized rock. It was probably roughly the size of a softball. While trying to both hurry and be as quiet as possible, I made my way out of the woods and towards the car. Paul's blood-curdling screams pulsed through my body. It was horrible, but it also provided me with some cover, so the man wouldn't hear me coming. I made it to the road and paced around the back of the car. Paul was laying in the fetal position on the ground, squirming around while doing his best to avoid the strikes the man was giving him. It turned out that the man was actually using a piece of pipe. I was even more terrified to discover the man was using a piece of steel rather than a piece of wood. In a fit of absolute rage, I began to see red and threw myself at the man with the rock in my hand. I struck him in the back of the head with every bit of force I had in me. The man let out an incredibly loud scream, like he was screaming while all the air was knocked out of him at the same time. The man fell down onto his knees. He attempted to stand up but was incredibly wobbly and kept falling down to one knee. I looked down at Paul. He laid there motionless in the fetal position. I didn't know if he was still alive. I had hit the man so hard that the rock flew out of my hand. I looked around for it but didn't see it. The steel pipe had rolled away a bit after the man dropped it. The rage inside of me continued to grow and grow. It grew to a level I never felt before. I kept thinking that this was all over a simple mistake that didn't hurt anyone. We even apologized, and yet he terrorized us and potentially murdered my friend. With no objects I could use as a weapon immediately nearby, I charged at the man as he was attempting to stand up again. I tackled him as hard as I could, and he went to the ground very easily. I was on top of him and started striking him. I gave it everything I had in me. Several punches missed the man, and I was pretty sure I had broken my hand on the pavement. I couldn't even feel it at the time with all the adrenaline pumping through my veins. After landing several very hard strikes to the man's face, he went unconscious. I knew at this point I could stop striking him, but something inside me kept me going. I grabbed the man by his hair, held his head in place, and continued to beat on him. I wanted to disfigure him and break every bone in his face. I punched him and punched him. Then, I suddenly thought of Paul. I stood up and ran to Paul. Luckily he was breathing and I found a pulse, but he was knocked out hard. I shook him and yelled his name, but I wasn't able to get him to come to. I called 911 and explained what happened. Several minutes later, a police cruiser showed up. At this point, both Paul and the man were still unconscious. The police officers began to question me. I tried staying as calm as possible so I could explain everything to them. Since they didn't know what happened for sure, I was put in handcuffs and detained. I knew it looked pretty bad for me at the time, since my hands were covered in blood and 2 other people were left laying on the ground bloody and beaten. Shortly after the 2 police cruisers were on scene, EMS showed up. They immediately started working on Paul and the other man. After several minutes, one of the paramedics came over to check on me while I was talking with one of the police officers. He looked me over and said that I would need to go to the hospital to have my hands checked out by a doctor. At this point, the adrenaline had begun to wear off and my left hand was excruciating. I kept calling over to the other paramedics to ask how Paul was. They were busy working and ignored me. The man I had beaten up was wheeled into an ambulance. They took off with him immediately. I could tell that the other paramedics were getting the other ambulance ready for Paul. My heart began to sink as I feared the worst. They began loading him into the ambulance. Out of nowhere, I heard someone weakly yell my name. "Mark! Mark!" It was Paul. I began yelling back to him. I wanted to run over to him, but the police officer wouldn't let me. I was brought to the police station where my picture was taken, my fingerprints were taken, and even my DNA was taken since I was initially charged with a felony. After sitting in a small cell overnight, I was transferred downtown where I was going to be arraigned by a judge. I just couldn't believe that this was happening. While waiting to see the judge, I spoke briefly with a public defender about what happened. The conversation was short and I was left feeling pretty hopeless. About a half hour later, the bailiff called my name and I was expecting to see the judge. Instead, I was brought back to speak with the public defender. Not a moment too soon, The officers investigating the case were finally allowed by doctors to speak with Paul. Paul told them everything that happened, and that the last thing he remembered was the man walking towards him. Since Paul was unconscious and obviously wasn't able to make up a story with me, they knew he and I were telling the truth since our stories matched perfectly. All of the evidence they had looked at matched what he said as well. To make things even easier for us, the man, whose name turned out to be Dave, had a criminal record, including prior violent crimes. The judge overseeing my case was presented with all of this information, and I was completely acquitted of all charges. After Paul spoke with the officers, his condition started to get worse, and eventually he was put into a drug-induced coma. He remained that way for 48 hours until the doctors were able to get him stabilized. Once he regained consciousness, I went to go see him. I had no idea how badly he was hurt until now. It was awful seeing him like this. He began to cry when I got to his room. His parents, who I knew quite well, began to hug and thank me. Apparently, Paul was beaten bad enough to the point where he barely survived. The doctor said despite everything, he ended up quite lucky. If I hadn't intervened exactly when I did, the doctor said he would have most likely died from his brain swelling. Although he was in bad shape, he was expected to fully recover over time, which he did. The man, Dave, also survived. He ended up with more facial damage than anything. He had to undergo facial reconstruction surgery, but still ended up looking somewhat disfigured after. I'm happy that every time he looks in the mirror, he's going to be reminded of the fact that he got what he deserved for attacking an innocent person. Paul and I are still friends. A couple months later, he's basically 100% recovered from this. He still has marks on his face and head, but they're expected to fade over time. We still play Pokemon together, although these days, we don't go out at night.